The atmosphere in the room was charged with a mixture of anticipation and skepticism. The audience, a blend of students and faculty members, sat in quiet expectation, knowing they were about to witness a confrontation that was as intellectually stimulating as it was emotionally charged. A figure stood at the front, addressing the crowd with an air of superiority. His words were sharp, precise, and cutting, aimed at dismantling the very foundation of a belief system that had guided millions for centuries. The lecture hall was alive with murmurs as the professor made his point. His arguments were clear. Religion, particularly the teachings of Christianity, was nothing more than a collection of myths and outdated ideologies. To him, the concept of Jesus Christ was simply a fairy tale, a story created to provide comfort to those unable to face the harsh realities of life. His words, laced with sarcasm, struck at the heart of Christian doctrine. He spoke with authority, making it clear that he had no patience for what he considered to be irrational beliefs. The crowd, already familiar with his views, listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others unsure of how to respond. But there was one in the room who would not be swept along by the professor's words. Amidst the sea of nodding heads, there was a young man who remained still, his expression unreadable. Unlike others who might have shifted uncomfortably in their seats or quietly agreed with the points being made, this individual held his ground. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, but it was evident that the words being spoken struck a deep chord within him. As the professor continued his mockery, the young man's mind raced, processing the flood of arguments that were being laid out before him. But he wasn't responding in the way others might expect. There was no visible anger, no flare of emotion. He simply sat there, calm, as though preparing himself for something inevitable. The professor, relishing the attention he had garnered, continued his verbal assault. His tone was condescending as he mocked the notion of miracles and the divinity of Christ. He even went as far as to reduce the life of Jesus to a mere mythological figure, as though he were a character in an ancient fable. The professor's challenge was clear. How could anyone still hold on to such antiquated ideas in an age defined by reason, science, and progress? To him, those who clung to their faith were simply living in denial, hiding from the complexities and difficulties of the modern world. The students who sat listening to the professor were mostly engaged in this intellectual exercise. They appeared intrigued by the professor's arguments, some even jotting down notes as though this was just another academic lecture. Yet, in the midst of this, a quiet tension began to build. There was an underlying sense that the professor's words were more than just academic. They were personal to those in the room who still held on to their faith, who saw Jesus not as a mere historical figure, but as a living, breathing force in their lives. But these feelings were not being vocalized. Instead, they lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. The professor, seemingly unaware of the impact of his words, pressed on. His message was clear. Belief in Jesus Christ was outdated, and those who held on to such beliefs were simply deluded. He had no intention of offering any real dialogue. His goal was to dismantle, to ridicule, to assert his intellectual superiority. The atmosphere in the room became almost tense, as though the crowd was bracing for something to happen, but unsure of what it would be. There was a palpable sense of discomfort, but it was not one of outright hostility. Instead, it was the kind of discomfort that arises when deeply held beliefs are publicly challenged, when something sacred is mocked in front of an audience. And then, amidst this sea of intellectual dissection and mockery, the young man's silence became more noticeable. It was as though his stillness contrasted sharply with the chaos of words swirling around him. While the rest of the room seemed caught in the flow of the professor's rhetoric, he remained unmoved, seemingly untouched by the words being hurled in every direction. His calmness wasn't that of a passive observer, but rather the steady resolve of someone who had already made up his mind about the truth of his beliefs, someone who had already reconciled with the question of faith and doubt. As the professor continued his tirade, a noticeable shift began to occur in the room. While the lecture had initially been met with passive acceptance, there was now a subtle tension that filled the air. The mocking tone of the professor had begun to reach its peak, as he seemed to delight in poking holes in a belief system that he dismissed as archaic and naive. His words had moved beyond mere academic discussion to something more personal, an attempt to strip away the very core of what many in the room held dear. It was clear that he believed his logic was unassailable, and that anyone who still clung to their faith was misguided, even foolish. But there was one person in the crowd who did not flinch, did not flounder under the weight of the professor's scorn. Where others might have bristled or become defensive, this individual remained composed, almost unnervingly so. He didn't engage in any visible way with the professor's taunts, nor did he react in any dramatic fashion. His posture was calm, his hands rested neatly on the desk in front of him. His face, though serious, gave nothing away. There was no sense of anger or frustration, only quiet resolve. It was as if he had been through this kind of challenge before and had long ago decided that no amount of mockery or skepticism would shake the foundation of his beliefs. This quiet defiance, the sheer ability to remain unmoved, contrasted sharply with the intensity of the professor's rhetoric. The room, charged with intellectual fervor, was abuzz with ideas and critiques. Yet this one person stood out for his quietude. He didn't need to prove anything. His calm demeanor was a statement in itself. There was an unspoken recognition that his silence was not a sign of weakness, but of profound strength. It was clear that his faith was not something he needed to justify to anyone. The professor's words, though sharp and designed to provoke, simply rolled off him like water off a duck's back. As the professor continued his assault on the concept of divinity and the supposed illogic of belief, the young man's thoughts remained focused, his mind free from the distractions of anger or doubt. There was no need for him to engage in the game of proving the professor wrong or challenging every point with a counter-argument. His belief in the truth of what he held dear didn't require validation from anyone. It was an internal certainty, something that had been forged over time through experience, reflection, and, most importantly, faith. The professor's words, no matter how sharp or scathing, could not touch that inner core. It was not as though the young man was unaware of the implications of the professor's arguments. He had heard similar criticisms before. Arguments about the impossibility of miracles, the contradictions in religious texts, and the apparent conflicts between science and faith. Yet, despite hearing such things time and again, he had never been swayed by them. His beliefs were not fragile, they were deeply rooted. The professor's logic, no matter how polished, could not dislodge the foundation that held his faith in place. To him, these were just words that lacked the power to change something so deeply personal. The young man's response was not one of confrontation, but of quiet strength. While others might have been tempted to speak out to defend their beliefs, he knew that true conviction did not require loud declarations. It didn't require winning an argument or outsmarting the other side. Faith, to him, was about knowing, something in your soul, something that didn't need to be proven to anyone. It was a quiet assurance that grew from lived experience, from understanding the value of compassion, the depth of love, and the transformative power of a belief that transcends reason. As the professor continued to dominate the conversation, it was impossible not to notice the stark contrast between him and the young man. Where the professor's rhetoric was filled with the energy of intellectual superiority and the rush of words designed to persuade, the young man's silence spoke volumes. It was not passive indifference, but an active rejection of the need to prove his beliefs to others. His peace was the result of a confidence that only comes with deep personal conviction. He wasn't trying to win a debate. He simply knew what he believed, and that was enough. The others in the room began to take notice, sensing the underlying power in his calmness. Some were perhaps unsure of how to interpret it. Was it apathy, detachment, or something else entirely? But for those who were truly paying attention, it was clear that this person was not uncomfortable with the professor's challenge. He was unshaken. His posture, his gaze, his silence were all a reflection of a belief that did not need to be defended or explained to anyone. The lecture hall was thick with anticipation. The professor, with his sharp words and dismissive tone, had been relentlessly deconstructing faith and religion, particularly the figure of Jesus Christ. His arguments were delivered with confidence and a sense of intellectual superiority, designed not only to challenge the audience but to dismantle their beliefs piece by piece. His words were chosen for their potency, crafted to sow doubt and plant seeds of skepticism in the minds of anyone who still clung to the idea of a divine Jesus. The audience, most of whom were accustomed to his teachings, listened closely, some absorbed in the logic of his arguments, others perhaps uneasy, but unwilling to speak out. However, as the professor pressed on with his intellectual assault, something shifted. The room, charged with the professor's energy, seemed to quiet in anticipation of the next moment. It was at that moment that the stillness of a single individual broke the flow of the professor's words. Without fanfare, without a dramatic gesture, this person, who had been listening with quiet intensity, stood up. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was steady and calm, devoid of any hint of anger or defensiveness. It wasn't an outburst, nor was it a challenge to the professor's position. It was simply a response, a measured, thoughtful reply that stood in stark contrast to the professor's aggressive tone. What followed was a moment of clarity that pierced through the professor's sharp rhetoric like a beam of light through a dense fog. The individual's words were not a rebuttal in the traditional sense. There were no counter-arguments presented to dismantle the professor's points. Instead, what was shared was a simple truth, one that came from deep personal conviction and lived experience. The response wasn't an intellectual sparring match, but a quiet expression of belief, spoken from the heart, with no need for debate. It wasn't an attempt to prove anyone wrong, nor was it an effort to invalidate the professor's perspective. It was instead a quiet declaration of the power and depth of faith, a faith that had been internalized so fully that it no longer required external validation or defense. The professor, who had been so sure of his ability to sway the audience with his logical arguments, now found himself on unfamiliar ground. His words, which had been intended to tear down a belief system, seemed to falter in the face of something far more profound than intellectual argument. The calm, unwavering response was not something he could dissect or dismiss with further rhetoric. It was a form of strength that didn't need to be justified, a certainty that did not rely on logic or scientific explanation. It was something beyond reason, a deeply personal truth that came not from books or theories, but from lived experiences. The room, which had been filled with the professor's confident proclamations, suddenly grew quiet. The shift was palpable, as though the air itself had thickened with the weight of the response. The professor, momentarily taken aback, paused. His intellectual arrogance, which had so easily swept through the room moments before, now seemed less certain, less powerful. The sharpness of his arguments, however well crafted, could not counter the quiet certainty that had just been spoken. It was not a challenge, but a reminder of something far more powerful than mere words, something that came from the depths of personal experience and belief. As the response settled into the room, it became clear that the impact of those few words was far greater than any counter-argument could have been. There was no need to explain or justify the faith being spoken of. It wasn't about disproving the professor's points or offering a list of logical fallacies in his reasoning. Instead, it was a simple acknowledgement of the transformative power of belief. The message was clear. Faith doesn't need to be defended against intellectual challenge because it stands on its own. It is something that cannot be reduced to a series of logical arguments or stripped away by ridicule. It is a truth that exists beyond the realm of academic discourse, one that doesn't require proof but is known in the heart. The professor, who had been so focused on dissecting the idea of Jesus Christ with intellectual precision, now found himself confronted with something that transcended his arguments. His belief in the power of reason and logic had been challenged not by more reason or logic, but by something far more profound. It was a moment of humility for him, though he may not have fully realized it. In the face of unwavering faith, his rhetoric seemed to lose its sting, and for the first time, the professor found himself without a response. His words, which had flowed so easily, now faltered, unable to reach the depth of conviction that had just been shared. The The response that had left the room in stunned silence was not just a defense of faith, but a quiet reminder of its enduring power. In a world that often values intellectual superiority and logical argument, it was a rare and humbling moment, one that demonstrated that some truths are simply too powerful to be torn down by words alone. The silence that followed spoke volumes, leaving the audience to reflect on the message that had just been delivered. The room, which had once been charged with intellectual fervor, now settled into a quiet, almost reverential stillness. The professor, whose words had earlier seemed so unassailable, stood momentarily speechless, caught in the unexpected weight of the response that had just been delivered. His earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by a subtle unease that he couldn't quite shake. It was clear that something profound had just happened, something that his sharp rhetoric and logical arguments hadn't been able to predict or prepare for. For a few moments, the professor stood there, seemingly unsure of how to proceed. His intellectual confidence, which had carried him through many debates and discussions, was now at odds with the quiet power of the response that had disrupted his carefully constructed narrative. He had come to the front of the room prepared to engage in a battle of ideas, certain that his position would prevail through reason and argument. But now, in the wake of the calm, unwavering words that had been spoken, he found himself standing at a crossroads. His usual strategies for intellectual confrontation, honed over years of teaching and debate, suddenly felt hollow. The unspoken truth in the room was undeniable. Sometimes words, no matter how logically sound, are not enough to dismantle deep personal conviction. The audience, who had initially been drawn into the professor's intellectual assault, began to process the moment in their own ways. Some were still caught in the logic of the professor's arguments, wondering if they had been too quick to dismiss his points. Others, however, could not ignore the impact of the response that had been delivered with such grace and clarity. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and they were now seeing the entire discussion in a new light. They began to question the limits of reason, wondering if perhaps there was something more to faith than could be captured by argument alone. For some in the room, the response had ignited a shift in perspective, a realization that perhaps the professor's approach had been too narrow, too focused on logic and proof. They had been following along, nodding at the well-crafted points the professor had made, but now they were left with a lingering question. Could reason alone ever truly capture the essence of something as profound as faith? The quiet strength that had been shared in response to the professor's mocking words had forced them to consider a different possibility, that there was a truth beyond logic, one that could not be reduced to facts and figures, one that was felt in the heart rather than reasoned through the mind. The professor, despite his intellectual prowess, seemed ill-equipped to respond to this shift. His usual method of dominating the conversation with pointed arguments and sharp retorts no longer seemed appropriate. The silence that followed his last words, the stillness that had overtaken the room, was not just a pause in the conversation. It was a sign of something deeper. It was as though the room itself had absorbed the weight of the response and was unwilling to let it go. The moment hung in the air, thick with reflection, and the sense that something truly significant had taken place. There was a subtle shift among the students in the room as well. The usual dynamics of a classroom debate had been upended. Some looked around, unsure of how to process what had just occurred. It was not a confrontation in the traditional sense. There had been no raised voices or fiery exchanges. Instead, it was a quiet, resolute statement that had captured the essence of faith in a way that words alone often could not. The professor's challenge had been met not with forceful counter-arguments, but with a quiet, powerful expression of belief that resonated far deeper than any intellectual challenge could. As the moment stretched on, the professor's earlier bravado seemed increasingly out of place. His position, once seemingly unassailable, now seemed fragile. There was a subtle discomfort in the air, a tension that was not easily explained. He was, for the first time in the discussion, forced to confront something that could not be easily dismissed. The room had shifted. The professor, once the unquestioned authority, now found himself in a space where logic and reason were no longer the only tools of persuasion. He was faced with something more profound, an unshakable faith that had the power to leave even the most well-argued positions in question. In the aftermath of the exchange, the professor's silence spoke volumes. He could no longer carry on with the debate in the same way. His intellectual certainty, once so commanding, had been tempered by something intangible, something that reason alone could not touch. The audience, too, was left in a state of reflection. The simple, powerful response had not just altered the course of the conversation, it had altered their perspective on the entire discussion. What they had witnessed was a moment of quiet strength that spoke to the power of belief, to the reality that sometimes faith cannot be proved or disproved through argument. It simply is, standing firm in the face of the most sophisticated challenges, leaving everyone in its wake to reconsider the depths of their own convictions. As the silence lingered in the room, it became clear that what had just unfolded was not simply a debate about faith or reason, but an exploration of the deeper forces that drive human conviction. The professor, typically at ease in intellectual battles, had been momentarily disarmed by something that could not be reduced to logical argument. This was not the victory of one over the other, but rather a moment where the very nature of truth and belief had been brought to the forefront. The students in the room, many of whom had likely entered with their own preconceptions about religion and logic, were now left to wrestle with the weight of their own beliefs. The exchange had opened a space for reflection, a reminder that faith is not always something that can be neatly packaged into intellectual frameworks. What was perhaps most remarkable was how the response, quiet yet powerful, left such a profound impact without the need for confrontation. It wasn't about triumphing in the traditional sense of winning an argument, but about asserting a deeper truth that resonated on a human level. For some, it may have been a wake-up call, a gentle reminder that the matters of the heart and soul are not easily captured by the sharpness of logic. That truth often operates in ways that transcend human understanding, and that some of the most powerful forces in the world are intangible and unquantifiable. The experience reminded everyone in that room that some things are felt in the depths of one's being rather than argued into existence. For the professor, the silence was no less profound. His usual mode of persuasion, grounded in logic and intellect, had met a force that could not be overpowered with reason alone. It left him, if only for a moment, questioning the limitations of his own approach. Intellectual prowess could only go so far in addressing the complexities of the human experience, especially when it came to matters of faith. In that moment, the professor found himself caught between the certainty of his reasoning and the intangible truth that had just been spoken. As the room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, there was a collective sense of awe. The lesson wasn't in the specific words that had been exchanged, but in the understanding that truth and conviction can take many forms. Sometimes the most profound moments of clarity come not from the loudest voices or the sharpest arguments, but from quiet, unwavering belief that is deeply rooted in personal experience. The impact of that belief, when shared authentically, has the power to challenge even the most carefully constructed ideologies. The exchange left behind more than just an intellectual takeaway. It prompted a shift in how those present viewed not just faith, but the nature of truth itself. It reminded everyone that while intellect and reason are important tools for understanding the world, they are not the only tools at our disposal. At the heart of every belief, every conviction, there lies a deeper, unspoken truth that transcends logic. Sometimes the most profound truths are simply felt rather than explained. And in this room, for a fleeting moment, everyone had been reminded of that.